Welcome to my virtual presentation, and the topic of my presentation is experimental research. I'm Dr. Kibet from the Center for Open Distance and E-Learning, Machakos University. What is experimental research? Experimental research is a method in which the investigator manipulates a variable under carefully controlled conditions and observes whether there are changes in a second variable as a result. An experiment has the following components: an hypothesis, a dependent variable, and experimental controls. In an experimental study, the participants are carefully selected and matched on a number of variables that could potentially affect the results. These are gender, age, school experience, etc. and etc. What is an hypothesis? Research in developmental psychology begins by formulating an hypothesis, which is an educated or informed case or a possible explanation for a behavior being studied. An hypothesis expressed as a prediction or as a statement of cause and effect. A scientific hypothesis is based on facts and theories that have been gathered and investigated by previous researchers or observations by the researcher. It is posed in a way that indicates how the results can be measured, thus making it verifiable. It may or may be not correct, since it is possible explanation of behavior and it is subject to verification or proof through a scientific study. There are two types of hypotheses. One is the alternative hypothesis, which is positively stated. For example, there is a relationship between diet and the rate of child development. The second one is called the null hypothesis or the zero hypothesis, which is negatively stated. For example, there is no relationship between motivation and academic performance. There is no relationship between the mother's diet and the birth weight of a newborn. A variable. What is a variable? A variable is a factor that may vary or change. It can assume more than one value. For example, factors such as weight, height, scores on a test, motivation, and so on. An independent variable. An independent variable is a factor that is selected and manipulated by an experimenter and is independent of anything the subject does. The experimenter can vary it as he or she thinks is necessary in terms of what he wants to achieve. On the other hand, we have the second variable called the dependent variable, which refers to a measurable behavior or outcome exhibited by the subject and is affected by the independent variable. Its value is dependent on the independent variable. It is what you measure after varying or manipulating the independent variable. For example, stimulation influences the development of motor skills. Stimulation here would be the independent variable, whereas the motor skills are the dependent variables. The third type of a variable is what is known as extraneous variable. This is a factor that may influence the results if it is not adequately controlled. Such factors would include intelligence, age, past experience and fatigue. These are variables that they can confuse or compound the results. And finally, let's look at what we call experimental controls. In an experiment, the researcher randomly assigns subjects to experimental and control groups. The experimental group receives treatment with the aim of discovering whether the treatment has a predictable effect on some outcome or behavior, which is the dependent variable. The control group or non-treatment group does not receive such treatment so as to ensure that any changes in the dependent variable are due to the treatment administered. The two groups are expected to have similar attributes or characteristics. The effects of this treatment is assessed by comparing the two groups after the treatment is given to the experimental group. And that marks the end of my virtual presentation today, where I have been discussing about the experimental research. Thank you.